There are cases that haunt a community, and then there are cases that haunt the people assigned to solve them. In October 2012, veteran investigators in Colorado, officers who had seen violent crimes, fatal crashes, domestic homicides, and scenes most people could not stomach, found themselves sitting in silence after processing a crime scene. Some of them requested counseling. Others admitted privately that what they witnessed would not leave their minds. The brutality was not just shocking, it was comprehensible, because the victim was not an adult entangled in criminal life. She was 10 years old. She had been walking to school, and in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Westminster, Colorado, she vanished. This is the story of Jessica Ridgeway. On the morning of October 5th, 2012, Jessica Ridgeway stepped out of her family's home in Westminster, a quiet suburb northwest of Denver. The sky was clear, the kind of pale blue that often stretches over Colorado in early autumn. The air carried that crisp seasonal shift, cool enough for a light jacket, but not yet winter. It was a weekday, a school morning, structured and routine. Jessica was 10 years old and in 5th grade at Witt Elementary School. She was known for her expressive personality. Teachers remembered her as attentive and animated, someone who participated rather than faded into the background. She liked attention in the harmless, playful way children do, performing impressions, making classmates laugh, turning small moments into mini productions. At home, she had the energy of someone constantly in motion. She moved between interests quickly. One week focused on cheerleading, another on crafts, another on social drama that felt monumental at the time, but would dissolve by the next afternoon. She talked freely, asked questions, and filled quiet spaces with conversations. There was nothing in her behavior that suggested fear or distress that morning. No hesitation, no visible anxiety. Nothing that would have signaled that this day would separate itself from every other Friday before it. The route from her house to school was familiar, sidewalks lined with modest homes, lawns trimmed, driveways empty as parents had already left for work. It was a neighborhood designed around the assumption of safety, the kind of place where children rode bikes in the summer and where neighbors recognized each other's cars. Jessica had walked the route before. It was not an experiment in independence. It was a continuation of it. Her family trusted the environment. The distance was manageable, visible, and close enough that nothing about it felt risky. And around 8:30 a.m., she left. The timing was ordinary. School will begin soon. Other students were likely moving through the same streets, some on foot, some arriving by car. Nothing about the morning carried urgency. But when she failed to arrive at Witt Elementary, that normalcy began to fracture. Attendance records showed her absent. Teachers expected her to walk through the door any moment. A late arrival, a minor delay. Perhaps she had stopped to talk with someone. When she did not appear, the school staff contacted her family. The initial response was confusion. There was no known reason for her to miss class. She had left on time. She had not mentioned feeling ill. She had not requested to stay home. As minutes turned into an hour, confusion shifted into concern. Then came the discovery. Her backpack and water bottle were located near an intersection several blocks from her house. The items were not scattered across the ground as if dropped mid-stride. They were found together, still recognizable, still intact. It was a small detail, but it altered the direction of every assumption. A child might misplace something. A child might drop an item while running, but belongings placed near a roadway, separated from their owner, suggested intervention. Between her front door and the classroom she never reached, something had interrupted the morning. And in that short stretch of suburban sidewalk, bordered by fences, driveways, and quiet homes, someone had been watching. When it became clear that Jessica Ridgeway had not arrived at school, the response from Westminster police was immediate but controlled. At first, officers approached it the way they approach many missing child calls. Verify last known location, confirm timeline, check with family, friends, and school officials. But within a short while, the tone changed. Jessica had left home on time. She had not been reported absent from school before. There were no known family disputes, no custody conflicts, no indication that she had planned to run away. The circumstances lacked the ambiguity that sometimes delays urgency, so officers shifted quickly from verification to mobilization. Patrol units began canvassing the neighborhood block by block. Officers knocked on doors and asked residents if they had seen a 10-year-old girl walking alone that morning. Some neighbors seeing children on their usual routes. Others remembered nothing unusual. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes and businesses were identified and reviewed. Detectives looked for any vehicle that slowed unexpectedly, any unfamiliar car parked along the curb, any pattern that broke routine. The location created a focal point. Crime scene tape went up. The intersection was photographed. Officers documented the exact position of each item before collecting them. This was no longer treated as a missing person case. It was treated as a potential abduction. An Amber Alert was issued. The alert included Jessica's description, her age, height, clothing, and the last known location where she had been seen. Phones buzzed across Colorado. Electronic highway signs displayed her name. News stations interrupted programming to broadcast her photograph. By the afternoon, the search had expanded beyond Westminster. Helicopters from local law enforcement circled overhead, scanning open spaces, construction sites, and wooded areas. K-9 units tracked Jessica's scent from the backpack's location outward, following trails through sidewalks and across patches of grass. At certain points, the scent abruptly ended, a detail that often indicates entry into a vehicle. Search teams fan net out into nearby parks and fields. Drainage canals were examined. Volunteers formed organized grid patterns, walking shoulder to shoulder through open terrain to ensure no ground was left unchecked. Community centers became coordination hubs. Volunteers signed in, received maps, and were assigned search sectors. Many wore pink in solidarity. Some brought their own children with them, holding their hands tightly as they walked. The emotional atmosphere was palpable. Parents who once viewed their neighborhood as insulated from serious crime began recalibrating. School dismissal procedures were tightened immediately. Children were escorted in groups. After-school activities saw increased adult supervision. The assumption of safety, something rarely examined in suburban life, was suddenly questioned. Local media coverage intensified. Reporters stood near the taped-off intersection, delivering updates in real time. Interviews with family members aired across television screens. Jessica's photograph, smiling, youthful, unaware, became instantly recognizable. Meanwhile, investigators worked behind the scenes. The FBI joined the case, providing additional manpower and technical resources. Analysts began reviewing known offenders in the region. Registered sex offenders living nearby were identified and, in some cases, interviewed. Detectives examined any prior incidents involving attempted abductions in surrounding communities. Tips poured in. Thousands of them. Some came from residents reporting suspicious vans. Others described unfamiliar individuals seen days earlier. Each tip required documentation and evaluation. Phone banks were established to process the volume. Even implausible leads had to be assessed because in cases involving children, dismissal can cost critical time. As evening approached on the first day, floodlights illuminated search zones. Volunteers refused to leave. Some brought flashlights and continued scanning brush and underpasses long after sunset. But as night fell and no sign of Jessica was found, a quiet shift began. Search efforts that start with urgency often carry the hope of finding a child hiding, injured but alive, waiting to be discovered. With each passing hour, that hope becomes more fragile. By the second day, investigators were working in rotations. Sleep was limited. Strategy meetings became more focused. They mapped Jessica's route, measured distances, calculated timing windows. How long would it take to force someone into a vehicle? How visible would that interaction have been at 8:30 a.m.? The absence of eyewitnesses troubled them. Westminster was not a remote rural area. It was populated, active, and lived in. The fact that a child could disappear during daylight without immediate witnesses suggested speed and planning. By the third day, the search had extended beyond immediate neighborhoods into surrounding cities. Law enforcement coordinated with agencies across the Denver metropolitan area. Information was shared across jurisdictions to prevent duplication and to identify patterns. Community prayer vigils were organized. Candles flickered in public parks. People who had never met Jessica felt personally invested. But days passed, and as investigators continued processing evidence and chasing leads, the emotional tone shifted from urgent optimism to something heavier. The search had not stopped, but hope was beginning to change shape. On October 10th, 2012, 5 days after Jessica Ridgeway vanished on her way to school, the search took a devastating turn. A woman walking her dog in a park in Arvada, Colorado, noticed something unusual in an open area of the terrain. It was not a place people typically stopped. The land was uneven, partially isolated, bordered by natural growth and patches of undeveloped ground. What she SAW did not belong there. She contacted authorities. Officers responded quickly. Within minutes, the area was cordoned off. Patrol units blocked nearby access points. Yellow tape stretched across pathways and around sections of brush. What had been a quiet walking trail became an active crime scene. Investigators approached carefully. When they confirmed what had been found was human remains, the atmosphere shifted from procedure to gravity. The location was approximately 7 miles from Jessica's home in Westminster. That distance mattered. It suggested transportation. It suggested planning. It suggested that the crime scene was not confined to a single location, but potentially multiple sites of abduction, assault, disposal. Forensic teams began documenting everything. Photographs were taken before anything was moved. The ground was examined for impressions, footprints, tire tracks, and drag marks. Soil samples were collected. Every fragment, every fiber, every trace of biological evidence was treated as potentially critical. The condition of the remains made clear that this was not an accidental death or a spontaneous act of violence. The injuries indicated intent, control, and a level of brutality that even experienced investigators struggled to reconcile with the age of the victim. Identification required forensic confirmation. Dental records and DNA analysis were used to ensure accuracy before public announcements were made. When authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to Jessica, the news rippled across Colorado. For her family, hope collapsed in certainty. For the community, fear transformed into mourning. For investigators, the case entered a new phase. The discovery site was processed over hours, then days. Specialists in forensic pathology examined evidence to determine cause and manner of death. Analysts worked to establish a timeline. They studied decomposition patterns, environmental exposure, and any indications of movement after death. The brutality encountered at that scene left a mark on those who were there. Veteran officers later acknowledged that the images were difficult to compartmentalize. Many had spent decades responding to violent incidents, yet child homicide cases carry a different psychological weight. The scale of harm inflicted on someone so young disrupts even hardened emotional defenses. Some investigators sought formal counseling. Others relied on internal peer support within their departments. It was not simply what they saw, it was what it represented. A child who had left for school in daylight, a community that had mobilized in hope, and now evidence of calculated violence laid out before them. But emotional response could not interfere with Judy. The scene held answers, from the way the remains were positioned, to trace materials recovered nearby, to biological samples that would later be processed in laboratories. Each element became a thread, and somewhere within those threads was the identity of the person responsible. The recovery operation was methodical. Nothing was rushed. Evidence was packaged, labeled, and transported under controlled conditions. Investigators understood that the strength of their case would depend on precision. When the scene was finally cleared, it left behind more than disturbed earth. It left behind a turning point. The search for a missing child had become a homicide investigation. And from that moment forward, the objective narrowed to find who did this, prove it, and make sure the evidence spoke clearly enough that no detail would ever be questioned in court. After the recovery of Jessica Ridgeway, the investigation narrowed with intense precision. This arch phase had ended. Now the case depended on science. Forensic specialists worked in controlled laboratory environments, processing every viable piece of biological material collected from the recovery site. Swabs were taken. Samples were preserved under strict chain of custody protocols. Each fragment was cataloged and logged because in cases of this magnitude, even a procedural error could compromise justice later. Among the evidence recovered was biological material believed to belong to the perpetrator. That discovery changed the trajectory of the investigation. DNA became the central pillar of the case. The profile extracted from the evidence was developed into a genetic sequence that could be compared against known offenders. Investigators entered the profile into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database used by law enforcement agencies to match unknown samples to individuals previously convicted of qualifying crimes. They waited, but no match returned. That result was both frustrating and revealing. If the suspect's DNA did not appear in CODIS, it likely meant he had never been convicted of a felony that required DNA submission. He was either someone with no criminal record or someone whose prior conduct had not resulted in a qualifying entry. This was not a career criminal whose identity would surface immediately through the system. Investigators had to pivot. Without a database hit, the case demanded local narrowing. Detectives began reviewing geographic patterns. They mapped the abduction site, the recovery location in Arvada, and the probable transportation route between the two. They examined traffic flow, residential proximity, and areas where someone could move without drawing attention. Simultaneously, they initiated targeted DNA collection. Registered sex offenders living within defined radii of Jessica's disappearance were contacted. Detectives requested voluntary DNA samples. Many complied quickly, eager to eliminate themselves from suspicion. Others required court orders compelling submission. Swabs were collected methodically. Each sample was processed and compared against the unknown profile, but no match. Investigators expanded their scope beyond registered offenders. They reviewed individuals who had prior arrests for violent behavior, even if those arrests did not result in convictions. They looked at persons of interest identified through tips. Thousands of tips had come in during the search phase. Now, those tips were filtered through a more focused lens. Did any name overlap geographically? Did any tip describe someone with unusual behavior in the days surrounding October 5th? Time mattered. Each day without an arrest heightened public anxiety. Parents were still driving children to school. Community routines had not returned to normal. The knowledge that the perpetrator remained unidentified created a pervasive unease. Behind closed doors, investigative teams worked in coordinated units. The Westminster Police Department collaborated with federal partners and neighboring jurisdictions. Analysts reconstructed timelines. They examined surveillance footage from intersections, gas stations, and residential cameras. They looked for vehicles traveling unusual routes during the narrow window of Jessica's disappearance. Then something shifted. Investigators identified a possible connection involving a local teenager named Austin Sigg. At the time, Sigg was 17 years old. He lived in the region. He attended high school. On the surface, he appeared unremarkable, a quiet student with no significant criminal record. But detectives had received information that drew attention to him. According to investigative records, Sigg's mother had contacted authorities after noticing suspicious behavior.
Hi, this is Molly at Westminster Police. Can I help you?
Hi, I need you to come to my house. My son wants to turn himself in for the Jessica Ridgeway murder.
Can you tell me exactly what he said?
But he did it, and he gave me details, and her remains are in my house.
Did you see them?
No.
Is he there with you?
Yes.
Is he cooperative?
Yes.
What is your son's name?
Austin Sigg.
Okay, I understand that you're probably, feeling pretty crappy right now, but I want you to know that you did the right thing by calling.
He did it. He just wanted me to call. He is turning himself in.
Okay, do you think that he's going to be cooperative with the officers?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you think that Austin would talk to me?
Will you talk to him? Yeah, hold on.
Okay.
Hello?
Is this Austin?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Austin. This is Molly at the Westminster Police Department.
Hi.
Can you tell me a little bit about what's going on right now, or how you're feeling, or how did this come about?
I don't exactly get why you're asking these questions. I murdered Jessica Ridgeway.
Okay.
I have proof that I did it. There is no other question. You just have to send a squad car, something down here, and
Right.
I will answer all the questions that you want to ask,
Okay.
or anyone wants to ask of me as soon as you gotta get down here.
Okay. Have you committed any crimes like this before? This the first? Do you have a criminal history of any sort?
The only other thing that I have done that before this was the Kettner Lake incident where the woman got attacked. That was me.
Ma'am, I understand you want to call your husband, and I'm sorry, but I would like to keep you guys on the phone just until the officers get a little bit closer.
Well, how far are they?
They're going to be there in just a few minutes. Is Austin still there with you?
Yeah, I won't let him out of my sight.
Okay. Has Austin been diagnosed with any mental health issues? Does he see a counselor or take any medications?
He saw a counselor years ago for porn.
Okay.
I can't breathe.
Take some deep breaths for me. Do you want me to start you an ambulance?
No.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
Okay, what just happened?
I opened the window.
What's that?
I just opened the window.
Okay.
I need air.
Okay. Mindy, take a couple deep breaths for me, okay? You tell me when the officers get there. They're coming to your front door. Okay?
I don't see him. I don't see him yet.
You don't see them?
No.
Is Austin okay with you right now?
Yeah, he's just getting really anxious, and so am I.
Okay.
They're here. They're coming up.
They're coming up to the door?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see the plainclothes officers and their badges?
Yeah, they're here.
Okay, I'll let you go speak with them, okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye.
Reports later indicated she discovered evidence linking him to the crime, items and circumstances she could not ignore. The specific details of what prompted her call were not publicly disclosed in full, but her decision proved pivotal. When officers arrived at the Sigg residence, they obtained DNA from Austin Sigg. The comparison was immediate and definitive. The DNA matched the profile recovered from Jessica's remains. The probability of error was astronomically low. In forensic terms, the match established identity with scientific certainty. On October 17, 2012, 12 days after Jessica disappeared, law enforcement held a press conference announcing a major development. They had identified and arrested a suspect. The name stunned the community, not an older career offender, not a stranger passing through Colorado, not someone hiding on the margins of society, but a 17-year-old local student. He lived within driving distance of the abduction site. He had attended classes. He had neighbors who saw him regularly. There had been no public indication that he posed a threat of this magnitude. The psychological shock was profound. Investigators revealed that Sigg had confessed after being confronted with the DNA evidence. He admitted to abducting Jessica as she walked to school. He described placing her into his vehicle. He provided details that only the perpetrator would know. For officers who had processed the recovery scene, knowing that the perpetrator was a teenager intensified the dissonance. It challenged assumptions about profile and predictability. Sigg had reportedly studied mortuary science in high school. He has expressed interest in forensic pathology. Those facts, when later disclosed, added another layer of unease. This was not random chaos. There were indications of planning, and from a prosecutorial standpoint, the case was strong. From a human standpoint, it was deeply disturbing. According to court records, Sigg admitted that he strangled her to death on October 5, 2012, after he abducted her while she was walking to school and took her to his bedroom. He then dismembered her body and dumped her torso inside plastic bags along a roadway where it would be found. This alone caused an uproar. During questioning, he also acknowledged involvement in a separate violent incident months earlier. In May 2012, a woman jogging in the same general region had been attacked from behind. The assailant attempted to restrain her, but she fought back. She managed to escape and report the attack. At the time, that case had not been definitively solved. Now it was connected. Sigg admitted responsibility for that attempted abduction. The timeline investigators had been assembling began to take clearer shape. What had appeared to be a single catastrophic act now looked like escalation. The May attack demonstrated rehearsal, an attempt that failed. The October abduction showed progress. Detectives examined Sigg's background more closely. Public records and court documents later revealed that he had been enrolled in classes focused on criminal justice and forensic science. He had expressed interest in mortuary science and had studied crime scene procedures. Investigators uncovered online activity indicating a fascination with serial killers and violent crime. While interest in criminal psychology alone does not predict behavior, in this context, it became part of a broader pattern. According to prosecutors, Sig had developed violent fantasies that intensified over time. During interviews, he reportedly spoke about urges he had been struggling to control. The confession suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous rage. He had chosen a location. He had selected a victim of opportunity. He had transported her away from the abduction site. The calculated nature of the crime disturbed investigators deeply. When search warrants were executed at Sig's residence, additional evidence was recovered. Authorities did not publicly release every detail, but they confirmed that items seized from the home directly linked him to the homicide. The presence of corroborating physical evidence strengthened the prosecutorial case significantly. One of the most haunting aspects of the confession was its tone. Law enforcement officials later indicated that Sig did not appear confused about what he had done. He articulated the sequence of events with clarity. For officers accustomed to suspects minimizing or deflecting responsibility, the straightforward admission was unsettling in a different way. There was no prolonged manhunt, no high-speed chase, no dramatic standoff. The break came quietly, through laboratory analysis and a phone call from a concerned parent. Sig's mother's involvement became a pivotal piece of the narrative. Her decision to report her own son underscored the complexity of the situation. It was an act that would permanently alter her family's life, but ultimately aided the investigation. The community reaction intensified once the details of the confession became public. A 17-year-old. That number alone dominated headlines. He was months away from turning 18. He had been attending school. He had classmates who now watched news reports featuring his name. Neighbors described him as quiet, not violent. There had been no widely known prior arrests. The contrast between his age and the severity of the crime created cognitive dissonance. Prosecutors moved quickly to clarify their position. Given the gravity of the offense, kidnapping and first-degree murder, they announced their intent to try Sig as an adult. Under Colorado law, certain violent felonies committed by juveniles can be transferred to adult court. The decision signaled how seriously the state viewed the crime. In court filings, prosecutors detailed the evidence: the DNA match, the confession, the corroborating items recovered from his home, and the connection to the earlier attempted abduction. The case was not circumstantial. It was layered with forensic confirmation and self-incriminating statements. Defense attorneys began preparing mitigation arguments centered on age and mental health. Reports emerged that Sig had exhibited concerning behaviors prior to the crime, though none had resulted in intervention sufficient to prevent escalation. Psychological evaluations would later become part of court proceedings, examining whether underlying disorders influenced his actions. But for investigators, the confession did not provide emotional closure. They still carried the images from the recovery site. They still remembered the early days of the search, when volunteers believed Jessica might be found alive. Knowing the identity of the perpetrator did not erase those memories. For the Ridgeway family, the confession meant answers, but answers accompanied by unbearable detail. Court proceedings would require them to hear descriptions of what had happened to their daughter. The legal process, while necessary, would reopen wounds repeatedly. In many homicide cases, families wait years for resolution. In this case, the timeline from disappearance to arrest was measured in less than 2 weeks. From an investigative standpoint, that speed reflected coordination and scientific efficiency. From a human standpoint, it did not lessen the devastation. The confession marked the end of uncertainty. It marked the beginning of prosecution, and it solidified a reality that continued to unsettle the community. The person responsible for one of the most horrifying crimes in recent Colorado history had been a teenager living among them, harboring violent fantasies that had moved from thought to action. The question was no longer who. It was how someone so young had crossed a line so permanent, and how the justice system would respond. Once Austin Sigg was formally charged, the case transitioned from investigation to prosecution with unusual speed. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There were no lingering questions about identity. The focus now shifted to accountability. Because Sigg was 17 at the time of the crime, one of the early legal considerations was jurisdiction. Prosecutors pursued the case in adult court due to the severity of the charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault. The decision reflected both the brutality of the offense and Colorado statutes that allow juveniles to be tried as adults for certain violent felonies. As preter IEL proceedings unfolded, it became clear that this would not be a lengthy courtroom battle centered on disputed FOTCTs. The strength of the forensic evidence and the confession limited the viability of a defense STR adage aimed at acquittal. In 2013, Sigg entered a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Jessica Ridgeway, as well as kidnapping and attempted sexual assault related to the earlier attack on the jogger. By doing so, he waived his right to a trial. The plea had significant implications. A trial would have required prosecutors to present detailed forensic evidence publicly. It would have involved testimony from investigators, forensic pathologists, and potentially graphic descriptions of what had been done to Jessica. Her family would have been present for every moment, forced to listen as the events were reconstructed in open court. The guilty plea eliminated that possibility. It spared the Ridgeway family from reliving the most traumatic details in a prolonged adversarial setting. But it did not reduce the emotional weight of sentencing. When the day of sentencing arrived, the courtroom was filled with tension. Members of the community attended. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case were present. Media coverage remained intense, as it had since the day Jessica disappeared. Victim impact statements are among the most powerful moments in any sentencing hearing. The why shift the focus from the defendant to the human cost of the crime. Jessica's mother addressed the court. Her statement did not center on anger alone. It centered on absence. She spoke of the future that had been stolen, graduations that would never occur, friendships that would never deepen, a life that would never unfold. She described birthdays that would pass without celebration, holidays that would carry a permanent emptiness. She articulated what statistics cannot capture: the ripple effect of violence. A child's death does not impact only a single household. It fractures extended family, friends, classmates, teachers, and an entire community that once searched with hope. The courtroom was silent as she spoke. Sigg, who had confessed months earlier, now faced formal judgment. Under Colorado law at the time, a conviction for first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The court had limited discretion regarding the primary charge. The judge imposed life imprisonment without parole for the murder conviction. In addition, Sigg received an additional 86 years for the kidnapping and related offenses. The cumulative sentence ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The sentence reflected both punishment and permanence. For the earlier attempted abduction victim, the sentencing carried its own significance. Her survival had once been an isolated incident. Now it was part of a documented pattern of escalation that had culminated in homicide. The court's acknowledgement of that attack validated her experience and incorporated it into the broader narrative of accountability. Although the guilty plea brought procedural closure, it did not erase the complexity of the case. Sig's age remained a point of discussion. 17 at the time of the offense, he was legally a juvenile when he committed the crimes, but treated as an adult in sentencing. Debates emerged about juvenile sentencing laws, brain development, and the boundaries of rehabilitation versus retribution. However, given the severity and premeditated nature of the offense, the court's ruling reflected the legal framework in place at the time. For investigators and prosecutors, the conclusion of the case marked the end of an intense chapter. The rapid resolution from disappearance to sentencing in roughly a year was notable. The coordination between forensic teams, local law enforcement, and federal agencies had produced a swift and definitive outcome. For the Ridgeway family, the sentencing offered finality in a legal sense. But finality in court does not equate to healing. The empty chair at family gatherings remains. The silence in the bedroom remains. The milestones imagined for a child remain frozen in time. When the proceedings concluded, Sig was transported to begin serving his sentence in the Colorado prison system. When the investigation into Jessica Ridgeway finally reached its legal conclusion, the public narrative shifted towards sentencing, justice, and community healing. But inside police departments and forensic units, the story did not end when the courtroom emptied. For many of the officers who had worked the case from the beginning, the aftermath was psychological rather than procedural. Processing homicide scenes is part of law enforcement training. Officers are taught to observe rather than react, to collect rather than interpret emotionally, and to maintain professional distance from the violence they encounter. Over time, that training becomes a habit. Documentation replaces shock. Procedure replaces instinct. But crimes involving children exist in a different category. Investigators assigned to the recovery scene in Arvada were not just managing a homicide. They were confronting the violent death of a 10-year-old child whose disappearance had already mobilized an entire region. Many of them had children of their own. Some had participated in search efforts days earlier, hoping for a different outcome. Now they were tasked with processing evidence in a setting that directly contradicted those hopes. Forensic responsibilities required them to remain present for extended periods. They had to examine the scene carefully, record details precisely, and recover material that would later become central to prosecution. Each step demanded attention, even as the emotional impact of what they were seeing accumulated. Several officers later acknowledged that the experience did not remain confined to the workplace. Sleep patterns changed. Some reported recurring intrusive thoughts connected to the scene. Others found themselves unusually protective of their own families, altering routines, or monitoring their children's movements more closely. Emotional responses that were normally contained during investigations surfaced afterwards, sometimes unexpectedly. In response, departments encouraged access to professional counseling services. Peer support programs were utilized more actively than usual. Informal debriefings among investigators became spaces where experiences could be discussed without the constraints of courtroom language or evidentiary standards. The case prompted internal reflection about how law enforcement agencies prepare personnel for exposure to extreme violence involving minors. Training had long emphasized technical competence in how to secure a scene, how to preserve biological evidence, and how to maintain chain of custody. Increasingly, it became clear that psychological resilience required its own infrastructure. Exposure to traumatic material was not a hypothetical risk. It was an occupational reality. For some, therapy is necessary. For others, structured peer conversations provided a measure of stability. Either way, the investigation reinforced a point that departments sometimes hesitate to acknowledge publicly. The burden of violent crime does not rest exclusively on victims' families. It extends to the individuals required to witness, document, and explain those crimes within the justice system. Law enforcement personnel are trained to compartmentalize, but certain cases resist containment. This was one of them. In the months following the disappearance and death of Jessica Ridgeway, the physical landscape of Westminster remained the same. Streets were repaved, schools continued their schedules, parks reopened. Yet the way residents moved through those spaces had shifted. Before October 2012, it was common for elementary school students to walk short distances between home and classroom without supervision. Neighborhood familiarity created a sense of informal safety. Parents knew one another. Teachers recognized families by name. The routine of morning drop-offs often occurred on sidewalks rather than in vehicles. Afterward, those routines changed. Parents who had once encouraged independence began accompanying their children to bus stops or driving them directly to school entrances. Informal walking groups replaced solitary commutes. Conversations about safety moved from occasional reminders to daily instruction. Schools implemented revised protocols. Arrival and dismissal procedures were adjusted. Staff presence near entrances increased. Communication systems between administrators and local law enforcement were reviewed to ensure faster response times in the event of emergencies. Educational programs addressing personal safety and situational awareness were introduced for students across grade levels. Community events emerged as both memorial and response. Vigils were held in public spaces where residents gathered not only to mourn but to share information about child protection resources. Advocacy initiatives focused on teaching children how to recognize unsafe situations without fostering constant fear. Parents attended workshops on digital communication, neighborhood coordination, and reporting suspicious behavior. Jessica's name became part of those conversations, not solely as a symbol of loss, but as a reference point for vigilance. Her story informed local discussions about how quickly routine can be disrupted and how assumptions about safety can be challenged by isolated acts of violence. The case also influenced interactions beyond Westminster. Surrounding communities in the Denver metropolitan area examined their own procedures. Neighborhood watch groups expanded participation. Schools reviewed security policies that had previously been considered sufficient. Over time, visible signs of crisis diminished. Media coverage receded. Search flyers were replaced by seasonal announcements. Public attention moved toward other events. Yet the underlying adjustments remained embedded in daily behavior. The extra glance before crossing an intersection. The decision to wait with a child until a school bell rings. The preference for accompaniment over independence. A short walk to school had once been routine. Now it carries memories. The community adapted, but the illusion that proximity alone guarantees safety did not return in the same form. Some cases are solved with an arrest. Others are solved with a confession. But solving a case does not mean undoing it. The officers who worked the murder of Jessica Ridgeway found the suspect. They gathered the evidence, they secured a conviction. Justice, in the legal sense, was delivered, and still many of them carried images they could not erase. But some cases leave marks on everyone involved, and this was one of them. Make sure to subscribe for more.